2.5 years ago, we found Dr. John Calhoun knee-deep in mice in the mouse heaven he designed for the National Institute of Mental Health Animal Center near Washington. Dr. Calhoun wanted to find out what would happen to a mouse colony given everything mice need except living space. The result was chilling. 2.5 years ago, more than 2,000 mice were packed into Mouse City. Today, a tiny handful of survivors huddles in one corner of the city. Dr. Calhoun explains what the overcrowding did to Mouse City's inhabitants.
The last 1,000 animals born never learned to develop the social behaviors. They never learned to be aggressive, which is necessary in defense of home sites. They never learned to court. There was no mating. Being no mating, there were no progeny, and the older animals whose behavior was already becoming disrupted, they eventually reached an age too old to reproduce, and so it was all left up to these last 1,000 or so, whom we call the beautiful ones, because not engaging in any stressful activity and only paying attention to themselves, they groomed themselves well, so they looked very fine specimens. But from that point on, which was about the time that you were here 2.5 years ago, this reproduction totally ceased, and the animals have just aged and died.
At least one human group, the Eek tribe, discovered in Africa by Dr. Colin Turnbull, has gone through a similar terrible process, according to Dr. Calhoun.
The two conditions that they went through was that there was a decision on the then colonial government to make a wildlife preserve of this big valley, which was their home with their hunter-gatherers. They were moved up onto the mountainside and gathered together in much higher density. Instead of being spread out in small groups, they were all placed in one place, and also required to engage in an entirely different way of life, in which their social roles, everything they'd learned how to do had no meaning. Under those conditions, the social behavior broke down entirely. They began living. They still lived together, but their activities were just directed towards themselves. Everything you would think that's human disappeared.
Perhaps the most chilling conclusion from his Mouse City studies, says Dr. Calhoun, is that once this change in social behavior occurs, it apparently cannot be reversed.
It's this fact of apparent irreversible phase shifts that gives some of us a particular concern over the fate of the human situation, because we see worldwide the breaking down of social roles, the increase in contact both as a result of the breakdown of the social roles and because there are too many people, that this might lead to an overriding of our controls, of our total culture, and would be set into a process which would either fix us rigidly forever into some sort of global tribalism without any adaptation to change, or there would result perhaps eventually some decline, very much like we've seen here, but that postponed somewhat.
Dr. John B. Calhoun, with a very sobering look at a possible future for us. Bill Roberts from the National Institute of Mental Health Animal Center near Washington.
Dr. Calhoun, why do we have to make decisions now on our population control?
Well, the population's a very interesting one. There's a lot of talk about a population explosion. Well, there's no population explosion, at least not quite yet, and never has been, or I might say there's always been a population explosion. If we go back to about 40,000 years ago, there were perhaps 4.5 million people on Earth, And it had been not many fewer than this for the previous 2 million years of man's evolution. And then suddenly the numbers began to increase, and perhaps a little crude drawing here will show this. These are in millions now, and this is 1, 10, 100 million, 1 billion, and we go up above here. And if we take a time scale here, an inverse log, if we go back to 100,000 years ago, and we go back to, we'll make this then to 10,000 years ago, to 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, then 100, which is 1/10 to 1 year from some time in the future. So these are in time, in thousands of years. And if we look at population growth in this way, starting back about 40,000 years ago, population starting at about here has gone roughly along this direction. Now, this is a rather complex curve. It's a von Forster curve, but simply said, starting here at 40,000 years ago, it took about 20,000 years, about 20,000 years for the population to double. Then the next doubling required about 10,000 years. Then each doubling, 5,000 years to the next doubling, 2,500, and so on.
What doubling are we in now, Doctor?
We're in the 10th doubling, in the 11th doubling.
Is that the final one?
Well, pretty near, it might be. The final doubling, starting shortly after the next, up here, we're up in here, scale about right, at which the world population might be of the order of 4.5 billion now people, would require only 20 years to double. So starting from 20,000 years for the first doubling up to about 20 years if this historical process continues. Now, so that we're back here a little ways from that, not very far from early in the next century.
Can it be mathematically projected, Doctor, on a calendar year perhaps, when the population reaches the point where it outstrips our natural resources, our power supplies, our food supply?
When you say mathematically, this is what von Forster did, projecting this age-old trend, not age-old, 40,000 years, rather short time. If this trend continued, you would have instantaneous doubling. Well, we know that's impossible, and that's the critical question, is that something is going to happen, that man will be different from the start of man, and this is where man started about 40,000 years ago as a cultural animal, not as a biological animal. He went considerably back in time below that. But at beginning this new process when he, quote, now was the only animal who could really control his numbers, that is to keep enlarging them, which is increasing his own potentiality by so doing. And this has continued until now we hit a critical point here where this process can't continue. And so from this time 40,000 years ago to early in the next century defines what we call man. And man ends at this point, whether there are a lot of bodies around, he's going to have to be something quite different from what he has been historically. And so one thing that he could do, and we're certainly capable of doing it, is keep reproducing. So that's one choice. And another choice that we have, which will have to be in effect by early in the next century, is that he can stabilize the population. That is, one, he can keep going not very much longer, above 9, well, I haven't got this figure. This would have been at 9 billion. I haven't quite gotten my figures here. It's sort of doubled to 9 billion. But if this is the end point, if the number of children per adults continues as it's been in the past, there would be about 9 billion people at this point. if we begin slowing down so that the population can stabilize, which is the ecological model as we've tried to do for wildlife management, to maintain a stable population, then with fewer children, we might keep at this level, we have 7.5 billion. Now, the critical point here is how many adults. Ideally, there should be, at this upper optimum, 3.5 billion adults in order to make most effective the network of people communicating with people. However, if we go on there's a third choice, and this is the population will begin slowly to decline. And if we go towards that goal, we would have at that point roughly about 6.3 billion total people, with considerably less than 2 children per family.
Doctor, what do you think now of the stress on environmental problems, trying to solve them? Should government, the politicians, pay more attention to this problem, do you think? They're all interlaced. It isn't that simple, but...
Well, the environment is just one problem which we're focused on now, and this may be a real trap because we only look at the physical, biological aspects of our surroundings, whereas if we focused instead on what is a much more essential, comprehensive problem, and this is evolution and the designing of evolution. And in fact, we like to say that we are revolutionists here, but a particular kind of revolutionist, but you now spell differently. Now, we all know what this symbol is. This is prescription, but so we're concerned with the prescription for evolution, or the design of the future, the design of evolution. So we're revolutionists.
Well, Doctor, why are we falling into a trap paying so much attention to environment?
Well, we are in an environmental crisis. There's no question about it. The concern of the government in this question is good. The even greater concern, particularly at the college level, in the environmental teach-ins that are underway during April of this year, are extremely good movements, but they may be a very deathly trap. For this reason, that is, if we can focus just on the good environment, the biological environment, the physical environment, we will miss a great deal of what man is or could be, with a concern for increasing human potentiality. And again, we like to say we'd like to put mental, as the human capacity, back in environmental. And this is what we're all about. And we can set a trap. See, the trap we're setting here is we're looking at the environment on a strictly biological model and not a future evolutionary directed model, is that we can develop a stable population in which everything becomes fixed, be unchanging over time, and now we'll be back in a global tribal situation. Sure, we might survive for millions of years, but we aren't going anywhere. We're like the lungfish in Lake Manyara, who are in this same situation. They've handled it very effectively. Whenever stresses come along, they encapsulate themselves in a mud ball and wait out the dry period, and then come back when the environment's back in a suitable condition. So we could become lungfish, and evolution would essentially end.
What is government, or what should government be doing now? Is it aware of this problem, in your opinion? Are we doing enough? We're doing very little, aren't we?
I think there's not. I don't think it's necessarily leveled at the government. I think this is whatever comment that could be made here is one of general awareness of becoming involved in the design of evolution, the prescription for further evolution. We have to have a long time perspective, both in the past and the future, and where we may go, and that the issue, the big crisis now is not when we think of environment relating to number of people, it's not number of people, it's people times capacities of the average individual or the total human capacity. Now, if we can choose, now is the time for choosing a goal. And this part relates to numbers, but it also pertains to whether we're going to select from what has been the definition of man for the last 40,000 years, some aspect of this. One of these is what we call human potentiality, the capacities of the average individual to understand, to develop new insights, to communicate with his fellows more effectively. If that is a major overriding goal and is selected, and we select, and one of the necessities for that is maintaining a changing environment, which includes numbers, and the only way to do that now is to decrease numbers, so that if we choose the goal of gradually going into a declining population with increasing human potentiality, we're now at 1970. The critical point is about 75 years from now, but there's a tremendous time lag in social change. I mean, it's been only a very short time since the Supreme Court ruling for integration, and we've made lots of strides in some ways and very little in others. But this is a much more drastic change. And if we're going to change numbers towards a declining population, the whole attitude of people's values, the decisions, have to be made in a very short time. We've got, let's say, 15 years or to 1984. So, in essence, if we have about 15 years of grace or opportunity that this crisis presents to us, for which we can change our whole value system, or not change the value system, but change the mechanism for changing the value system. It's sort of a meta process. If we don't do it within this time, we will probably we will go into 1984 in the Orwellian sense. So this is why it's critical. It's the most why this time, right now, is the most critical time since some time before when man made this discovery, which probably took him about 15,000 years to learn how to discover a new kind of space, a conceptual world of ideas and progressive development of ideas. So that in the early primitive hunter group, they had about 15,000 years to solve their impasse of when they were stuck by the carrying capacity of the environment, of the physical environment. Now we're also stuck in a similar problem and have about 15 years. So it's quite a burden, and the entire future of evolution depends on the next 15 years. It's the people here now who are involved now, which is critical, and it's the question of involvement. I'm an ecologist, psychologist, however hybrid, and it's a question of environment, of involvement in the total environment of physical and social that is the crucial question in our studies here, which we use mice and rats and other animals for. And that's where we bring into focus our research, is on the question of involvement. And they are bitten up, and the one who is bitten fails to run away. There's one type of
Okay, Doctor.
and this is one of the types of lack of involvement, of total withdrawal from the reality of the environment that's compatible with that species.
What, 2,400 mice in this enclosure?
Something of the order. We don't know exactly what it is now. It's between 2,200 and 2,500 mice, that is bodies, moving bodies, but they're really only about 150 mice in here. Real mice, that is mice who are in the social swim. All the others have been rejected in one way or another.
What's happened?
In which reproductive behavior is completely inhibited. It's inhibited because the last few hundred, maintained them as juveniles, and although they're now adults, they no longer engage in aggressive behavior or in reproductive behavior. And we call them the beautiful ones because they're so excellent physically, they're unstressed. I see one down here. Most of these live in the apartment houses and rarely come out, but I see one who's taken temporary refuge in one of the nesting material supply cans, and I'll go over and pull him out so that you can see what a beautiful specimen this animal is.
But as far as the mouse is concerned, he's a nothing? Is that...
He's a total nothing.
Okay, can you...
Now here he is lying in the, you going?
Go ahead, Doctor.
Here he is lying in the can. It's a place of temporary retreat. He's colored, very few, practically no wounds. He's in excellent physical shape. He has 2 or 3 nicks, but compared to most of the animals, he's in excellent shape. And these animals, from previous study, shows that they are unstressed. They're just not here insofar as involvement.
That you started this experiment with just a few mice some 20 months ago. Apparently, you've been able to dissect some. Have you noticed any changes in tissue?
Well, the major thing...
Stress.
The major thing, well, certain classes of these, for instance, comparing these males on the floor here who are withdrawn, they are highly stressed animals, but the stress comes from each other because of this peculiar violence that they exhibit, which leaves them as this animal with his tail all chewed up, but they do it to each other. These are highly stressed individuals. On the other hand, the beautiful one, which I just showed you, are very extremely unstressed, and we've run the Dr. Julius Axelrod has run the assay of the enzyme which converts noradrenaline to adrenaline as the basis for this. On the other hand, we've been removing females from other populations just terminated and looking at their uteri. And for animals up to a year of age who've come up in the latter history of the colonies, there's essentially no evidence of conceiving. So there's, at this stage, this is part of the overliving phenomenon. And it's these individuals who are not conceiving are the ones which are not stressed. They're the beautiful ones who lack involvement. So that's the essential story of what's going on in our studies.
Have you been surprised, Doctor, about the results of this, what you've learned so far? Some 20 months ago, did you think all these things were going to happen?
Well, I had a slightly different hypothesis which held true only in the early stages, and this was that the larger the space, the smaller the ultimate population density. That's proved not to be true, but a second aspect of that hypothesis was that the larger the space with reference to the number of colonizers, the slower it would get started. And this has been true because the essential analogy here is that when there are few animals, as in this particular universe, a male, any mouse when he was out would rarely meet another. And therefore, he identified with all of his physical environment. Mm-hmm. So his own ego boundaries extended out to include all of these things, which he was committed to. And therefore, any other animal coming out and moving towards any portion of that would elicit anxiety and therefore aggression. And we have huge territories, and this is an essential formulation of territoriality. So that in the larger the space, the more likely animals develop territoriality and the more extreme. And this did inhibit initial reproductive rate. And so with we have smaller universes than this, and they grew much faster, got started quicker. So that's another facet of this problem, that gradually washed out beyond a certain level, and then the population increased for a while fairly rapidly, and then it hit this level at which animals began being rejected out into public space as the males living on the floor here. The females are rejected, but they just don't come out. They stay back in the apartment houses.
Doctor, one final question here. As a human...
Okay, Carl.
Dr. Calhoun, as a human being, after going through this experiment, what goes through your mind? Are you worried about the future of mankind?
A pathological situation like this gives us an understanding of what may be going on in the human situation, or what might go on and be catastrophic. And what is really catastrophic and where the real fear is on a level where the mice and man are extremely similar. That is, the mice have programs. They're like little computers. And this is basically genetic with a much smaller element of learned behavior. And too high contact rate disorganizes the program so that it gets washed out, so it's disconnected or it doesn't express itself. This is where you get the lack of involvement. On the human level, we do have a much more complex brain. It does get programmed, less by genetics, less by heredity than for the mice, much more cultural. But it's just as subject to being disorganized, to having a program disorganized through inappropriate sequences of contacts, too many contacts. And so that we have this danger, and part of the danger is that we don't have an adequate establishment. We're now seeing, because the quote establishment doesn't provide all appropriate channels, we should destroy the establishment. We need a better establishment to allow interrelationships to protect us from too many contacts, but to allow us for those contacts which we do engage in to be more meaningful for our own lives and for meaningful to others in a compassionate sense of each of us being involved in helping the other to fulfill his roles. We'll have many more roles, and this is where the notion of compassion comes in, is helping each of us, helping others to fulfill their programs for development. And so we're at this peculiar stage where you're highly optimistic, at the same time highly pessimistic, and you wish to throw your weight, intellectual weight, to moving towards the optimistic side, to opening up continuing evolution.